Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This week we've been talking about this idea of spiritual warfare and making available the free ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. We spent some time looking at some of our armor, whether it's the belt of truth or the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith. Today I thought we may focus a little bit on the helmet of salvation, in particular looking at some of these philosophies and worldviews that challenge the Christian faith. We'll come back to that as well on our weekend edition tomorrow, but I thought it would be good today to get into that. So first of all, I'm going to have some things to say about a number of items in the news, but then at the bottom of this hour, we'll have a chance to hear from Dr. David Marshall, who'll be in studio as we talk about his book, Jesus Is No Myth, The Fingerprints of God on the Gospels, and that will give you just a little bit of an understanding on how to defend the Bible and give you some very good insight from this new book that's out. In the second hour, in studio with us, Nick Pitts, and we'll be talking about the various philosophies and worldviews that challenge the Christian faith. We've posted a couple of his articles, and he works with Jim Denison at the Denison Forum. So I'm looking forward to the 2 hours. I hope you can join us for all of that as we focus on some of these philosophies and worldviews that challenge the Christian faith and give you a little better understanding about how to defend them. Before we get to some of that, let me just take a few items in the news. One that came out today is that Apple is talking about making the iPhones in the United States. You heard that right. I mean, they have been making them over in China. As a matter of fact, there's one Taiwanese outfit that produces more than 200 million iPhones annually. But now they're starting to talk about whether or not in the future you might see at least some iPhones with Made in America labels. I talked a little bit about that yesterday. It would be, I think, a tendency for this current administration to say this is due to their economic policies, but do you not think it's at least possible that they're looking down the road and saying, if we have a President Donald Trump, he might actually want to slap a tariff on these, and maybe we should think about a better way for us to make iPhones in the United States. This would certainly bring a lot of jobs back to the United States and provide a very steady income, and this would be something to think about. So anyway, just another one of those stories we're going to be hearing from time to time, and I think it's important to ask the question, are they reacting to the current policies, or are they anticipating maybe different policies? And if you don't understand that, look at what came out today also from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. They said that President Obama has set a new record. Probably not a record you want to set, but nevertheless, it's a record for the most number of rules and regulations. Now think about at Apple, or you're a small business person in a print shop, or maybe you own your business and maybe you own a hardware store. You've got to look at those 527 pages, make sure there's nothing in those regulations that affect you. And according to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the administration, that is the Obama administration, has now shattered the old record for the number of pages and regulations published in the Federal Register. The number so far is 81,640 total pages. And you've got to remember, there's still 26 working days left before the end of this year. I won't talk about how many days there is till Christmas, but shopping days, but these are working days. than 3 weeks worth of possibilities for the federal government. And so many people are now estimating, Clyde Wayne Cruz, who's with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, that the Federal Register could top over 90,000 pages. And so this is a record that actually was set back again by President Obama in 2010. And now he's surpassed that and seems really on a race to do everything he can before he goes out of office. So this is, again, a world record, a record that is even greater than the record he set before. You got to remember, the old record had to do with all the regulations related to the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. And so, interestingly enough, Clyde Wayne Cruz, who is, again, with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, put it this way, said, President-elect Donald Trump could take a page from President Reagan, who brought the page counts down from Carter's 73,000 pages in the Federal Register down to as low of already 4,000. He says, you don't need a pen and a phone, you need a meat axe. And so there you go with all of those regulations. But just for a few minutes, I'd like to talk about your taxes and whether or not you would like to have some kind of tax simplification. And my commentary today is on that. So let me encourage you to go and to read it, to maybe share it, maybe take a copy of it, put it on your Facebook page or blog and start a conversation. Because one of the things that Donald Trump and his administration have called for is tax simplification. If you think that's not going to happen, I'll go back and look at, again, what is called the contract with the American voter. And this is an attempt to try to eliminate some of these complicated income tax forms. So for just a minute, I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a history that I put in there. This comes from an op-ed, and I give credit to John Steele Gordon, who points out that, after the Civil War, nearly all the taxes that we had, including the first income tax we had, were repealed. And so the federal government from the Civil War on to the 20th century pretty much relied mostly on tariffs on revenues. And this income, by the way, was more than enough to run the government. So when you think about taxes, there was a time when no one paid taxes to the federal government. And this was enough because there were actually surpluses being generated. The only problem with it was that because these were tariffs, they ended up being sort of like a consumption tax, which were regressive. In other words, since the poor have to spend a larger percentage of their income for the basic necessities of life than the wealthy, sometimes they end up being taxed. So this created, during the latter part of the 19th century, a lot of pressure to actually have an income tax on the rich. And President Grover Cleveland and the Democratic majorities that existed at that time in both houses of Congress passed an income tax that would only affect the 1%. Remember, we've been hearing about the 1%. Well, this would affect just the 1%. But it was attacked by the court because the Constitution requires that a direct tax be levied apportionately across the state, so the Supreme Court struck it down. So after that decision, pressure began to grow to tax incomes, and there were attempts to do so. And then you can fast forward to 1913 when the 16th Amendment was ratified, allowing for an income tax, and President Woodrow Wilson actually passed a personal income tax. But before that, even under William Howard Taft, there had been a stopgap measure where they had a tax on corporate profits. Well, that was supposed to be temporary, but it stayed around. So we now find ourselves in a situation where we have both a personal income tax and a corporate tax. Unfortunately, sometimes the rich pay one off against the other, but more importantly, it is just full of complexity and loopholes. Donald Trump says he wants to get rid of those, and the reason you have these loopholes is because you owe special favors to various lobbyists, various groups that fund your campaign. Whatever you may think about Donald Trump, you can come to one conclusion. He probably doesn't owe anybody anything. And so if there's ever been a chance to actually bring tax simplification, we may actually see that in the next session of Congress. So let me open up the phones and see if you have some thoughts about that. I've got some more about this, because what about the idea of not having to spend so much time in April going through all of the arcane income tax rules, but just simply having a simple tax that's easy to pay and easy to figure out? 1-800-351-1212. What are your thoughts?
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Donald Trump wants Congress to pass legislation that will implement tax simplification. We all know how complicated income tax forms can be, so let me give you a brief history provided by an op-ed by John Steele Gordon. After the Civil War, nearly all the taxes, including the nation's first income tax, were repealed, and the federal government relied mostly on tariffs for revenues. This income was more than enough to run the government and generated significant surpluses. The problem is that tariffs are essentially a consumption tax that is regressive. The poor are adversely affected because they have to spend a higher percentage of their income on necessities than the wealthy. This created political pressure to institute an income tax on the rich. President Grover Cleveland and the Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress passed an income tax that affected only the wealthiest 1% of Americans. The tax was attacked in the court because it represented a direct tax, which the Constitution requires to be apportioned equally among the states according to population. That was not the case and led to the Supreme Court striking down the law. After that decision, pressure grew to tax incomes of the largely untaxed rich. President William Howard Taft proposed a constitutional amendment to legalize a personal income tax while also imposing a tax on corporate profits as a stopgap measure. By 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified. President Woodrow Wilson promptly passed a personal income tax. Unfortunately, the corporate income tax, intended to be a stopgap, was left in place and often has been used by the rich to play one tax against the other. Today, we have separate corporate and personal income taxes with lots of complexity and loopholes that favor one group over another. That's why we need to change our tax code that is arbitrary, complex, and unfair. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you have been with us this week, you know that we focused a lot of time on this idea of spiritual warfare, and each day have looked at something like the belt of truth or the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, kind of focusing a little bit of time and attention in just a few minutes on the helmet of salvation. That is how we can certainly begin to defend the Christian faith from false views, philosophies, worldviews. We'll be talking about that in just a minute with Dr. David Marshall. And then Nick Pitts will be with us in the second hour as we get into that in more detail. But let me just mention that if you have not taken advantage of our free ebook, it's still available on our website, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It includes some material from a book that I've written a number of years ago on a biblical point of view on spiritual warfare. Added to it a whole section and introduction and even conclusions as well about material related to this kind of battle to restore Christ to the culture, how to really begin to be effective in this 21st century battle that we're fighting. And so I would encourage you to get a copy of it, and it is free. It's an ebook, and all you have to do is go to the website pointofview.net. If you'd like to join us on air, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about this idea of taxes, and you have to understand that the reason we have such a convoluted tax situation is due to the fact that there are all sorts of carve-outs and special grants and all sorts of political favors that are given to various companies. And the problem with that is that anybody who is elected to Congress
to the presidency usually comes into office owing some favors to those individuals who funded his or her campaign. And so they try to pay back, if you will, some of those favors through various kinds of loopholes in the tax plans. And as a result, we then end up with this arcane, Byzantine, complex, confusing tax manual that even people in the IRS oftentimes cannot figure out, as evidenced by the fact that over these years, when we've had Dan Pilla in or other individuals, we talked about how if you call the IRS tax call-in line, you can sometimes get different answers. You can call up and ask a question. You can hang up, call up again, and get a different answer from the same people that's supposed to be helping you. So this is, of course, one really significant issue. The other is just the incredible amount of tax burden. This last year, for example, we always call April 15th Tax Day. But if you really want to understand what it is, the real tax day or tax freedom day is April 18th. In other words, what they have done over time is calculate your tax burden and then divide the tally of all the taxes by the number of days and essentially point out that we see that our tax freedom day begins on the 18th of April, which means from January 1st to April 18th, you are basically paying for the federal government. But just a minute ago, I mentioned regulations because it's much more than that, because there have been individuals that have calculated what are called the cost of government day. The cost of government day actually then looks at the financial burden imposed on you by spending and regulation that occurs at the federal, state, and local levels. And it is usually in July. We are probably going to eventually have it going into August, but let's just use the July figure. That means that more than half of the year, you are actually working to support the federal, state, and local governments in terms of both taxes and regulations. And people have begun to try to even calculate the cost of those regulations. And these are almost astronomical. But again, let me just use one set of numbers that came out from the Heritage Foundation a number of years ago. And this was what they called red tape rising. Now, this is a few years old, so the number's higher, but I'll just use that there. When you look at the cost of regulation in terms of higher prices and limited product choices, and we're talking about everything. We're talking about toilets and shower heads and light bulbs and mattresses and washing machines and dryers and cars and ovens and refrigerators and television sets and bicycles and all of that, the annual cost is $1.75 trillion. So you can see that we are paying a tremendous amount in terms of cost of both taxes and regulations. And so one of the things that you might expect from this administration, and we'll have to see and also have to hold it accountable, is whether or not this administration coming into power, the Trump administration, would be willing to reduce the regulatory burden on businesses and be willing to simplify taxes. It's an opportunity. We've seen it before, squandered. We'll see whether this time it actually takes place. Let's take some phone calls along the way. 1-800-351-1212. We'll go first to Richard in South Carolina. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Kirby, appreciate your work that you're doing. My question is just a simple one. What about the possibility of having a flat tax? Do you think President-elect Trump would do that?
I think he might propose that or be willing to do that. If you look at the proposals that he has put together, and a lot of that's been illustrated by people like Stephen Moore, who's been on this program, and others, George Gilder and others, he would like to move towards a flatter tax. Would we get a truly flat tax? Well, the only way I think we could do it is to at least have a few exceptions. Richard, you and I know, for example, that two of those almost untouchable spots are, first of all, mortgage deduction for homeowners, and the other one is contributions. Now, I'll go out on a limb and say I'd be willing to have a truly flat tax even if I paid more. And I pay Actually, I actually give more in contributions than I pay in taxes. So that'll give you a little bit of an idea how much I give to ministries, because, you know, I know all sorts of people in Christian ministry. I sit on all sorts of boards. And so I would be hurt probably because I get some benefit, obviously, by all of my contributions that I give. But I give that up in a minute for the simpler tax form. And, of course, the idea that was first put forward by Dick Armey was, or even Phil Graham, was, could you fill out your taxes on what looks like a postcard? And that would be something that I think a lot of people would love. So, and again, you would have, of course, deductions so that individuals would not have to pay a flat tax if they are below the poverty line. So you need to understand that there would be that. But I think it makes a lot more sense to me.
I appreciate that. Hey, Kirk, keep up the good work. Don't you ever give up.
Well, thank you for calling in. Thank you for the encouragement. Again, if you would like to read a little bit more about just how we got an income tax, a lot of people say, how did we end up with this thing where we've got this very complex, difficult to understand income tax and all these complicated tax forms? And then we also have corporate tax, which is really, of course, hurting business. And Donald Trump would like to reduce some of those. And I think he's also one of those individuals that actually, if nothing else, would say, you know, even if it cost me more to actually provide an engine for growth and to simplify the lives. I don't have it in front of me, but I've written commentaries in the past on the estimation of the number of wasted hours every single year that people spend in terms of tax compliance. And I think you have a pretty good idea in your own experience what that looks like. So if you'd like to join the conversation, we might not have enough time to get into too many more of those because we are going to be talking with David Marshall in just a few minutes. But let me see if I can at least grab one or two more phone calls real quickly. Let's go to Florida. Jeannie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I had to delay my taxes and get an extension, and I paid them, and the approximate amount was $1,389 or something like that, and I sent it in. Well, I just got a letter last week saying that there was, I think I was $4 and something less than I owed, and they charged me 2 penalties for being late, and then they charged me a humongous amount of interest on that $4. Comes to $67 and something that I got to send them in.
And again, one of the things we've talked about on this program before, there are ways that you can appeal that. I'm not sure it's worth appealing it for $67, but if you think it is, there are ways in which to do that, and there's some great forms that we've had out there, even on our own website in the past, to help you do that. So let me encourage you to do that. But let's take one more phone call real quickly. We'll head to Alabama here. Ken, I've only got about a minute. What's your comment?
Yes, I saw the article about the amount of federal regulation there. It was just astonishing. I hope maybe someone can get a bug in Mr. Trump's ear, and he can mention the sentence or phrase from Ronald Reagan's famous speech, A Time for Choosing. He said that no great nation ever survived that had a tax that reached a third of its national income. You go read that text of that speech or play it on the YouTube video. You'll hear him say that.
Okay, good. I'll get to that. That would be, well, I'm going to use it in a commentary if I can find it. So thank you. I get all sorts of good ideas from some of our callers, from some of the guests we interview. And I've mentioned before, I get some of my best ideas from Facebook because people will post things like that. And I go, ooh, I didn't see that article. Oh, I didn't know that. So these are where a lot of those commentaries come from. And in some respects, your ideas end up in commentaries that we not only hear on this program, but are heard on many other networks around the country. When we come back, we're going to be talking with Dr. David Marshall. We'll be back right after this.
When you hear the phrase spiritual warfare, what comes to mind? If you have a negative reaction, that's unfortunate, because the Bible reveals that the battle is real. As Kirby recently wrote to our partners, Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. It warns us about being taken captive by alien philosophies and deceit. There is a spiritual battle underway for the minds of our neighbors. It's a time when the shapers of our culture are calling evil good and good evil. What can you do? Get a copy, a free copy of Kirby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy with our compliments at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, pointofview.net. Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture by Kirby Anderson. It's free when you visit pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
We're privileged to have in studio with us now David Marshall, and he is with the East-West Center for Christian Studies. We have a lot of great information about him on the website, and we'll be talking about his newest book, Jesus is No Myth. But first of all, David, I want to thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Let's, if we can, educate our listeners. Some of us that have followed your work in apologetics know you, but for many people, this is the first time they've had a chance to hear from you. And you've been in Japan. You just came back from China. You've had a chance to really look at culture and this whole area of apologetics. And one of the things we talk about here on Point of View is we really want Christians to know how to, first of all, articulate a biblical worldview, but also know how to defend a biblical worldview. And that's really a good part of what you've been involved in, isn't it?
It is indeed. I've been fascinated with Asian cultures for several decades, for more than 30 years now. That's actually what I got my doctorate in.
And so, again, you've looked at some of the cultural differences, but also talked about how first we can understand those cultures, but second of all, how we can begin to present Christianity and defend Christianity, true?
Yes. If you watch what St. Paul did when he came to the city of Athens, how he presented the gospel there, he recognized that the people who he was talking with were not completely estranged from the concept of God. They had some idea of a supreme God, and he used sayings and poems from the Stoic philosophers in order to present his message of Jesus Christ. And what I try to do in China is something very much like that. I believe that God has already been there in China all along. He created China, and therefore finding pointers to Christ within Chinese culture is something we shouldn't be too surprised about.
You know, in Acts 17, when you look at that, Paul has to sort of back up a little bit, because in Acts 13, he's in the synagogue. He can assume everybody believes in the Old Testament, has read the Old Testament, believes in a coming Messiah, believes in one true God. In Acts 17, he's got to kind of back up a little bit, find those connection points, but at the same time sort of make the case for Christianity. And I would think that in some of these Eastern cultures and even our more pagan culture here in the West, it's important for us to have maybe more of the methodology you see in Acts 17, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think it's the longest sermon directed at non-Jews, at Gentiles, in the entire New Testament. And it's the only place where the Stoic and Epicurean schools of thought are specifically mentioned. There are actually some very rich resources. If you look at some of the backstory there's some amazing things going on in that conversation.
Well, again, we are talking with David Marshall, and again, we'll give you all sorts of good information about him on the website. And before we get to your new book, Jesus is No Myth, I thought we'd talk about the New Atheist, because you can type your name in New Atheist, and of course, you've been writing about this for some time, and we're talking about Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens when he was alive, and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and those. You wrote one of the first books on this whole issue, and I think it's going to be more important, David, than ever before for us to know how to respond to the arguments of the New Atheist, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Even if Christopher Hitchens is gone, for when one falls, 30 other rise to take his place. And if you go online or you talk to people in the universities, listen to some of the professors, there's hundreds who would like to take Christopher Hitchens' place, and often by indoctrinating their students in some cases in anti-Christian thinking.
One of the things I'm kind of finding out is that most of our listeners will never run into Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or anybody like that, but they will run into those arguments because they show up on Facebook, they show up in blogs and those kinds of things. So I think we're going to have to really prepare people for the 21st century, recognizing that in the past, atheism was sort of apartheid. It sort of said, well, you can have your Christian views, but we have our atheistic views. We think you're probably wrong, but whatever, we believe in freedom of speech. But my sense with the New Atheist is, no, we won't live that kind of world anymore. Instead, we're going to say, you are not even allowed to have those views. Those views are delusional, the God delusion, and you shouldn't even be allowed to teach those ideas to your kids. So, David, I think we're dealing with a much more strident atheism than perhaps we've seen in previous generations.
Well, actually, I have an article coming out in First Things magazine in a couple months, which compares the communist propaganda within a history textbook that my students were using in China to some of the textbooks that we use in the United States, specifically in the Northwest, which I'm most familiar with. And some of the themes are pretty similar, actually. Some of the anti-Christian themes in the textbooks in American schools are very similar to what you see in communist China, very anti-Christian bias. One thing we can learn from missions is that people don't really care if Christianity is true until they know that it's useful, that it's good. And so I think we need to, as a pre-evangelism, as a way of explaining the gospel to people, we need to show people, which they don't learn in school, let me tell you. Mm-hmm. We need to show people how the gospel has dramatically changed the world for the better over the last 2,000 years. So I see that as part of my mission in writing. I want to let people know there's so many fantastic stories of how the gospel has transformed not only the West, but also the Eastern world, Asian world too.
You know, one of the people that you've interviewed is Rodney Stark, and we've had him on the program quite often.
Wonderful.
Because he has done such a good job, I think, over the years of talking about the contribution that Christianity had in ending slavery, or the contribution Christianity had in the rise of modern science, the contribution that Christianity had in really developing our Western culture. And it's the kind of teaching that takes place, and I think the kind of teaching you're doing that is necessary, because we have a whole generation here in the United States, and certainly even more so when you go overseas, that know nothing about the contribution of Christianity. And it seems to me that that's another very helpful apologetic, don't you think?
Absolutely. And Dr. Stark told me that he wrote himself into faith, mm-hmm. that in the process of researching Western history and world history, really, as a sociologist, and discovering again and again how the gospel has impacted the world for the better, that really opened his mind to thinking that Christianity, there might actually be something to it after all.
Again, I might recommend some of those interviews with Dr. Rodney Stark. We'll have those links that David Marshall has done some interviews with, and also you can type in Rodney Stark on our website, pointofview.net, and find some of those. And again, let me commend to you some of those books, which have been prominently mentioned by, Chuck Colson and Eric Metaxas and all sorts of other individuals. Let's see if we can get to your new book, Jesus is No Myth, The Fingerprints of God on the Gospels. And this is a real problem, because oftentimes we tend to talk about on this program people like Bart Ehrman, who are convincing a whole generation of young people that, the Bible's full of errors, the copies are different, and so as a result, we really can't trust the gospel. And I know you take on not only Bart Ehrman, but a number of other individuals that are really challenging our faith in the gospels, true?
Yes, and I found that I've been traveling around the United States for the last month. I've been focusing more and more on Dr. Ehrman in particular, because I've run into so many people who have been, I would say, you could use the word persuaded, but I'm tempted to use the word conned out of their faith by Dr. Ehrman's sometimes very sloppy and unscholarly arguments. And I found not only people who have contacted me directly, a Presbyterian pastor on the East Coast told me her son had lost his faith going to his class, Ehrman's class, and she was praying for him to return like Monica, the mother of St. Augustine. Other people have lost their faith because, particularly Dr. Ehrman, but also some of the other scholars and would-be scholars whom I deal with in this book.
Let's see if we can maybe talk about a few of the arguments. Obviously, I want people to get a copy of the book. We have a link there so they can get it in paperback, and I would encourage people to get a copy and read it and to pass it on to their friends. But one of those is that, we really just don't know what actually Jesus said. We don't really quite know what Peter and Paul and James said, because we have these copy errors. And now, how do you respond to that argument that is so prominently put out there and ends up in PBS specials and in all sorts of presentations in the academy?
I'm an historian. I'm not primarily a theologian, so my approach to the Gospels may be a little different from some people, but the way I look at it is something like this. First of all, I look at the Gospels, and one of the errors that Ehrman makes, and many other scholars, is they kind of open the Gospels and they see what jumps out at them.
Yes.
It's a kind of a cherry-picking sort of. You see traits in the Gospels that really stand out and catch your eye, and then you open the other book that you're comparing and looking for some sort of a parallel to the Gospels, and you say, oh, wow, this is really similar, because these two people both, they were both from the same city or something like that. But that's not a scientific or historical approach to the Gospels. A better way is to begin by looking at the Gospels themselves and finding out what the characteristics of the Gospels are before you open the other books and you see if there's any parallels to Jesus in the ancient world. And when I did that, first of all, I found 50 characteristics in the Gospels. Then I took 30 characteristics, which I call the fingerprints of God on the Gospels. Mm-hmm. And some of those have to do with the setting, some of those have to do with the timing, they have to do with the character of Jesus, which is unique, of course. Mm-hmm. Some of them have to do with Jesus' teaching on morality and many other different characteristics, which render Jesus not only different, as fingerprints can identify a person, but also they show that he is the Gospels are historically credible records of a person who actually lived. And I would say that the historical evidence for the Gospels for Jesus within the Gospels is greater than any other person that I know historically in the ancient world. Not only because of the traditional historical criteria that people talk about, but also because of these things that we tend to pick up on as human beings, but we can't always analyze them really carefully, really clearly in our minds.
Let's take a break, continue our conversation with Dr. David Marshall about his book, Jesus is No Myth, right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Along the trail that winds around the base of the Devil's Tower Monument in Wyoming is a sign placed there by the National Park Service. It's a humble wooden sign that reads simply, "Please do not disturb prayer bundles and prayer cloths." At first glance, the sign seems entirely out of place. Why would the National Park Service be instructing visitors to the nation's first national park about prayer bundles? As it turns out, the reason for the sign is an important lesson in religious liberty. Devil's Tower, known to several Native American tribes as Bear's Lodge, is sacred ground to several tribes. Often, Native Americans return to offer prayers, visible prayers, in the form of small bundles of cloth that visitors can see dangling from the magnificent ponderosa pine trees surrounding the base of Devil's Tower. This is how we integrate religious liberty into everyday life. The National Park Service works to protect the natural wonder that is Devil's Tower while giving preference to the religion of those who hold the mountain to be sacred. Visitors to the park demonstrate respect for the free exercise of the Native American religion by leaving such prayer bundles undisturbed. Sometimes respecting religious liberty takes a lot of effort. Other times, it just means staying on the trail. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. David Marshall as we talk about his book, Jesus is No Myth, the Fingerprints of God on the Gospels. You can find out more on our website. And, you know, one of the arguments for the inspiration of the Bible is its unity. I mean, written by 40 different authors over 1,500 years, 3 continents, 3 languages. And so whether you look at the similarities in the Gospels or even just the unity in the Bible, that seems to me to be a very good argument for its inspiration, don't you think?
Well, I found that all 4 Gospels share these 50 characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some differences. For example, in John, Jesus speaks with a voice that seems a little bit different from the synoptic Gospels, the first 3 Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
One can concede that. There are a few differences like that, but the similarities are much more important and much more outstanding. It's kind of like one of the things that really bothers me is the fact that so many academic skeptics try to bully their students and bully their readers as well. when often they're not using very good scholarship, and sometimes they're misquoting their sources, as I show very clearly Dr. Ehrman does over and over and over again. And one way to get beyond that bullying, of course, let me give you an example, a kind of a story, kind of a parallel analogy. My wife, several years ago, my wife is Japanese, and she was walking through the busiest train station in the world, which is Shibuya Eki in Tokyo. And she was walking with her mother. She goes back every summer to Japan for a couple months. And her mother started tugging on her shoulder and said, "Oh, who is that? Who is that woman who's looking at you?" It turned out to be her good friend from Seattle, also a Japanese woman. And flowing through this stream of humanity, tens of thousands, millions of people go through that station every day. Someone's coming the other direction, and just in a moment, in a flash, you recognize a face,
yes,
somebody that you know. Now, I would compare that to ordinary readers reading the Gospels. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice." One could analyze that scientifically. There are certain voice patterns, or there are certain fingerprint patterns, certain whirls and swirls in the fingerprints or DNA that demonstrate beyond doubt that this is from such and such a person. Or this is my friend from Seattle whom I haven't seen for several months, and suddenly I see her on the other side of the world, and there she is. I recognize her.
Yes.
Many of your listeners have probably had experiences like that because the human mind and ear and eye are programmed to recognize other human beings. I argue that as we read the Gospels, whether you have a PhD in New Testament literature or whether you're reading the Gospels for the first time, when you see Jesus and you recognize Jesus, "My sheep hear my voice," you come face to face. You are confronting a human being who is unlike anyone else who has ever lived, and you recognize the reality of that person. All I'm doing in this book is analyzing it historically.
Well, again, I think it shows the value of using historical method to look at the Gospels. Sometimes people that have a theological background don't have historical background, or individuals that we've talked about on this program that look at evidence, criminal investigators, lawyers, and others. Sometimes they've turned out to be really good apologists later on for the Christian faith. And so if nothing else, I was thinking, David, this might be an encouragement to have some of our listeners that are thinking about a major in college to consider history, because it really will prepare you to be able to evaluate evidence and to begin to even use that in a way to defend the gospel, don't you think?
Yes, and I think among the skeptics that I run into, the smartest the ones that can really put an argument together are generally philosophers.
Yes.
History, though, is basically it's the art of knowing what has happened in the past, and all science ultimately, even science, reduces to history, historical claims, because even if we say water boils at 0 degrees Celsius, that's a claim about experience in the past. And there are some of the new atheists who tend to deprecate history, but apart from the historical method, we generally can't know anything at all about the past, which means anything at all about the world around us.
So fascinating. Let's just, before I let you go, talk about what is available at the East-West Center for Christian Studies and some of the writing that you've done. We mentioned a couple of your books, and we'll have a list there, but especially if people wanted to get a copy of Jesus Is No Myth, they wanted to listen to some of the interviews you've done with Alan Chapman and Rodney Stark and many of the others. What are some of the best places to find some of that information?
Well, you can look at my blog, christthedao.blogspot.com, for some of the information that I've done. Also, we have another blog, christthedao.com, which has some of the interviews, although some of those are a little old now. I've just returned from China a few months ago, so we're starting some things new now.
Let's talk about how to use your book, too. Jesus Is No Myth. It seems to me that right now we have listeners that are maybe teaching a Sunday school class, maybe a Bible fellowship class, a small group, especially if they've run into individuals that are really beginning to be challenged by some of these arguments by Bart Ehrman, or your earlier book, maybe being challenged by some of the new atheists. It seems to me that this is not only a book that a person could read individually, but is there enough material there that an individual could use to teach a Sunday school class or a small group?
Oh, absolutely. This book is 300 pages long, and it's chock full of new information. And I would really love it if, first of all, if students, give a copy to some of your kids who are students. But I'd love to have students, college students in particular, read this book. And if someone wants to contact me about, cheaper rates for if they want to give some away to students. I'd love to do that because I really want this in the hands of students. I don't like it when people like Bart Ehrman abuse their authority, as he is doing, to hoodwink young people. All my books are also written for non-Christians.
Yeah.
I want non-Christians to read them, and I welcome challenges and responses from people.
That was my next question, because it seems to me that some people might say, well, okay, I'm not as smart as David Marshall, but I can get David Marshall's book and hand it to my non-Christian friend and let the intellect and the logic begin to work on them. So if they wanted to contact you, we have a link to Christ the Tao blog. Is that a good place to contact you, or is there a special email you'd like to give people?
Sure. They can contact me at drmarshall@163.com. That's a good email address.
Well, again, thank you so very much for being in studio with us today. This new book out called Jesus is No Myth, and we have a link to all the material available through David Marshall. So thank you for dropping by today.
Thank you so much.
Well, just before we run out of time here in the first hour, let me just mention again, we have lots of great material in the website and on the website, pointofview.net. Kind of a theme here on spiritual warfare. And on Monday, we talked about the belt of truth and really focused on some of those issues of truth and moral relativism. We, of course, yesterday talked about the breastplate of righteousness, and today the helmet of salvation, and that's why we wanted to bring Nick Pitts in studio in the second hour today to talk about philosophies and worldviews. But if you'd like to get a copy of the book by Dr. David Marshall, really will help you to defend the Christian faith. Jesus is No Myth, the Fingerprints of God on the Gospels, and we have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget that we also are making available this week an ebook. It's a free ebook called Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. The reason we're doing that is we recognize how important it is to really stand for truth and how spiritual warfare is very important. So this includes a few of the chapters from an earlier book that I've written on a biblical point of view on spiritual warfare. It includes some other things about culture. As we talk about, in many cases, when we're talking about politics here at Point of View, politics is really downstream from culture, and so we really think it's important for you to understand the battle that is taking place and why we need to make sure that we are thinking about this biblically and recognizing the weapons of our warfare, which is part of that spiritual warfare book, which we are making available for download, and it's free of charge. So that's one of the resources we wanted to put in your hand. My commentary today, which I talked about in the first part of the first hour on the income tax, is still available to you. And don't forget that normally on a Friday we have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford, and the two of them will be joining me on our Alaska cruise in August. They won't be with us tomorrow. Instead, Nick Pitts and Chelsea Yeoman will be with us. We'll have kind of a millennial roundtable. Looking forward to that. Let's take a break. Nick Pitts with the Denison Forum will be with us right after this.
When you hear the phrase spiritual warfare, what comes to mind? If you have a negative reaction, that's unfortunate, because the Bible reveals that the battle is real. As Kirby recently wrote to our partners, Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. It warns us about being taken captive by alien philosophies and deceit. There is a spiritual battle underway for the minds of our neighbors. It's a time when the shapers of our culture are calling evil good and good evil. What can you do? Get a copy, a free copy, of Kirby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy with our compliments at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, pointofview.net. Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture by Kirby Anderson. It's free when you visit pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track, and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This week we've been talking about spiritual warfare, and today we wanted to focus some time and attention on the helmet of salvation, in particular talking about some of the philosophies and worldviews that are certainly counter to Christian ideas, but we'll also be using that to talk about some of the issues in the news. And we thought that it would be outstanding if we could have Nick Pitts in studio with us again. He's the Director of Cultural Engagement at the Denison Forum for Truth and Culture. He is a PhD candidate at Dallas Baptist University, and along the way we might even talk about his dissertation having to do with John F. Kennedy's engagement of the religious community back in 1960. He is a graduate, for example, of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, served in the past as a director of college ministry at First Baptist Church in Arlington, also the editor of the Liberty Project. But most importantly, you can get Nick Pitts' daily briefing. I've got some of these on the screen here. And of course, Jim Denison's been a good friend of the ministry, and we're getting to know Nick a lot better. So always great to have you in studio with us.
Always good to be here, Kirby.
We have posted quite a number of articles, and one of those, which you had posted, because in most cases we get Jim Denison's daily article, but when he was in New York City for Movement Day, I believe, and then you went up for Movement Day, they let you put out one on activists use free speech to disrupt free speech rally. And I use that because what happens on a college campus seems to be happening now in all of these rallies. But the example used there was at the University of Toronto. But whether it happens there or whether it happens out in the street, we have this interesting irony going on right now where people are using free speech to actually prevent other people from having free speech.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There was a recent survey that was put out that said that 41% of college students think that the First Amendment is dangerous.
Yes.
And so we're living and moving in a world in which college students believe the opportunity to be able to openly discuss ideas on the college campus would be dangerous, where the college campus is the place where curiosity meets wisdom. Mm-hmm. But more often than not, it's looking for college students today that they want to hold on to the beliefs that they already have, and they want individuals to come in and continue to edify some of those beliefs, even if they're wrong, which is just detrimental not only in the present, but also as we make our way into the future.
We call them universities, and that comes from the Latin one and veritas, one truth. And they don't believe that there is one truth that's found in the Scriptures. They sort of believe that there's just one truth, and it's my truth, right? Isn't that kind of the problem, why they think the First Amendment's a problem?
Very much so. I mean, we're seeing not necessarily a new problem, right? So they're asking the question that Pilate asked back in John 18 as to what is truth. But more often than not, they're asking it, but not really wanting to seek an answer as much as they're wanting to seek affirmation for what they believe to be truth. Hence the reason why we have the word of the year in 2016, according to Oxford Dictionaries, being post-truth.
Post-truth,
yeah. And so this idea of post-truth not necessarily being wholly contingent upon how I feel in the particular moment. So we're just wanting claims, and we're wanting sources to be able to edify our pre-existing narratives that we're already working in.
Tomorrow we're going to be actually asking you to come back again, and with Chelsea Yeoman, and both of you are millennials, so we're going to really do a millennial program. We'd like to do more of those in the future, by the way. But whether you talk about those who have graduated from college, like the two of you, or those who are in college, you're finding out, as you said, that 41% of those Americans that are young actually think that the First Amendment is dangerous. But another Gallup poll showed that 69% of college students said that they would be in favor of prohibiting intentionally offensive speech. Well, we'll talk with Chelsea about maybe that tomorrow, but sometimes offensive speech could be that I believe
marriage is between one man and one woman. I believe that abortion is wrong. That could be offensive speech in the mindset of many millennials, right?
Exactly. And it's not just with millennials, too. We're seeing this is probably stretched out over the past 30 to 40 years. I mean, that's what we see with the rise of Donald Trump, right? The kind of going against the political correctness. Well, we saw political correctness make its heyday really begin to become popularized in the 80s. And at the very heart of political correctness was this understanding of trying to bring individuals together, not wanting to say something to bring, but it's empathetic correctness. In order to keep the unity, we don't want to say anything that might be able to trigger or emotionally break individuals. Hence the reason why you're seeing these trigger warnings, these microaggressions that are really taking the heightened expressions are happening on the college campus, all for the sake of unity. When in actuality, it's not really unity they want, it's conformity. And there's a radical difference. And I think our founders would have an understanding that we're seeking after unity, but not necessarily conformity.
So again, we need our unity through our therapy dogs and our hot chocolate. Was that what we've got? Our safe space and no trigger warnings? Is that what we're doing? Yeah. We had a dog here yesterday, and we said, well, that's our therapy dog. But everybody said would see the dog here because it really wasn't a very good therapy dog. But nevertheless, it's the kind of idea that we are seeing today. And I want to get into that in just a minute. But you're a historian, and you've been looking at this. You quote from John Milton in your piece there. And I think it's important to recognize that there was a time not so long ago that even liberals held to the idea that the university and the open forum was a place where we could grapple with these ideas, and that truth was found by the interaction of minds. And sometimes people say, well, whose right do you have to say that? I'll say, well, which policy should we implement? Yeah, which policy should we implement? I'd say, well, the one that has the best argument. But most people don't think that way anymore, do they?
I couldn't agree more. I think Ben Sass, the Republican out of North Nebraska, has really done a phenomenal job in championing this cause right now, of him kind of channeling the founders, believing it to be true, that these are significant ideas. That's why they gave us this free speech, to be able to wrestle and grapple with these significant ideas, because eternity is staked into these ideas. And like George Washington said, if you were to take away free speech, we would be like sheep that are led to the slaughter. It's the understanding that these are significant ideas that we should be able to wrestle with, one, and two, to be able to disagree one with another on, but still move towards those kind of transcendental ends of beauty, truth, and goodness.
When I first started speaking on college campuses, and I don't do that very much now because I'm doing this every day, but when I first started in the 1970s, I would be invited into a classroom, and even a very liberal professor would say, look, you've had a chance to hear my point of view, and I'd like to give another opportunity for you to hear a different point of view. Now, sometimes they would wait till I'd say something and then attack, but at least there was sort of this open idea. But we began to see that the opportunities to speak on campus began to dry up in the 1980s and just pretty much vanished in the 1990s. And a lot of that came to the idea of political correctness, that certain ideas simply are not deserving of a hearing on the college campus. And I think some of these people out protesting today are really pretty much saying the same thing, whether it's on the campus or out there in the public arena. Just certain ideas don't even deserve a fair evaluation, don't even deserve an opportunity to be exposed to the individual so that a rational person can make decisions.
Yeah, because, I mean, if anything, what we're seeing with the zeitgeist of the day is rationality is the last thing that would be characterized in kind of some of these movements that are happening today, right? Very much is driven by passions and by emotions, and really not allowing the logical light to be able to see the day, kind of epitomizing what David Hume would say, right? Our passion is our reason is but a slave to our desires, right? And so we're moving in such a world where gone is the day where we let truth and falsehood kind of grapple into a field, and now we're shackling truth and not even letting it have light in the public square, which is very unfortunate.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, spend a little more time talking about some of the controversy, and some of that shows up in these safe spaces and in these various rallies and protests. Some of it showed up in the NBA. I posted two pieces, one that you've written about, but also we are finding out that some of the NBA teams are saying, I just can't even go to a hotel that has the name Trump on it. And so you have a nice piece by an individual that is a commentator for the NBA, so we'll talk about that and get into a couple of other issues. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about Nick Pitts, we have posted a number of his articles here today, and we have him in studio. And let's also open up the phones. Perhaps you have some comments. 1-800-351-1212. Political correctness on campus and in the culture. What about that? We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Donald Trump wants Congress to pass legislation that will implement tax simplification. We all know how complicated income tax forms can be, so let me give you a brief history provided by an op-ed by John Steele Gordon. After the Civil War, nearly all the taxes, including the nation's first income tax, were repealed, and the federal government relied mostly on tariffs for revenues. This income was more than enough to run the government and generated significant surpluses. The problem is that tariffs are essentially a consumption tax that is regressive. The poor are adversely affected because they have to spend a higher percentage of their income on necessities than the wealthy. This created political pressure to institute an income tax on the rich. President Grover Cleveland and the Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress passed an income tax that affected only the wealthiest 1% of Americans. The tax was attacked in the court because it represented a direct tax, which the Constitution requires to be apportioned equally among the states according to population. That was not the case and led to the Supreme Court striking down the law. After that decision, pressure grew to tax incomes of the largely untaxed rich. President William Howard Taft proposed a constitutional amendment to legalize a personal income tax while also imposing a tax on corporate profits as a stopgap measure. By 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified. President Woodrow Wilson promptly passed a personal income tax. Unfortunately, the corporate income tax, intended to be a stopgap, was left in place and often has been used by the rich to play one tax against the other. Today, we have separate corporate and personal income taxes with lots of complexity and loopholes that favor one group over another. That's why we need to change our tax code that is arbitrary, complex, and unfair. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Nick Pitts in studio with us today, and again, the Director of Cultural Engagement for the Denison Forum on Truth and Culture. One of the articles we posted here, Ernie Johnson's response to the 2016 election goes viral, and that has to do with the NBA. Now, to set this up, let's recognize that there are some owners of the NBA that already have said, these are owners of the Bucks, the Grizzlies, and the Mavericks, we will not put our team in a Trump hotel. I'm not so sure that Mark Cuban put his team in a Trump hotel anyway, but okay, let's leave that as it is. So you have all sorts of reactions. I want to get to Colin Kaepernick and NFL in just a minute, but what about this on the NBA? Because you wrote this piece about Ernie Johnson, who admittedly is not exactly a Donald Trump fan, but said some things that I thought were worth mentioning, and you thought it was worth mentioning in one of your commentaries.
Yeah, I think Ernie Johnson very much kind of symbolized some of the American populace understanding when they went into the ballot box, right? They held their nose. They were less satisfied with the two particular candidates. And so Ernie Johnson very much kind of makes very much public what was a private vote of being he voted for John Kasich. But at the end of the day, though, he recognized that his vote was not going to be the one that won the day, that Donald Trump won the day and won the election. And now, in turn, as a Christian, he shifted. And on national television, on NBA, on TNT, he said that I'm going to continue to vote. I'm going to continue to pray for Donald Trump, recognizing the truth from 1 Timothy 2:2 that he is supposed to pray for his elected officials. And so regardless of whether his beliefs align with the candidate, his prayers shouldn't be hindered simply because his beliefs don't align.
Well, again, a little different than maybe Charles Barkley or some of the other. You think?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I mean, this one went viral, and you would think, well, that's just what you would expect every leader to do. But that's not what we're seeing right now, is it?
Yeah, it's very much fascinating. Who would have thought the day would have come when something would have gone viral, which should have been the norm,
yes,
especially among Christians. If we claim to especially be a Christian majority in this nation, this shouldn't be something that goes viral. This should just be something that happens, because that's what the biblical narrative would command of us.
Well, again, 1 Timothy 2 says that we are to, of course, pray for those in authority and those in high positions. And so I would certainly love to hear from our listeners. You know, do you think we should be praying for President Obama? I think so. Should we be praying for President-elect Donald Trump? I think so, too. And so Ernie Johnson got himself in a situation where everybody was forwarding his little video because they said, well, that's new. And as you pointed out, that's really not that new, but it's certainly one of those issues that, again, has become kind of the exception when it should have been the norm. Which brings us to the NFL. Colin Kaepernick, does he not illustrate some of the issues you've been talking about in terms of the millennial generation?
I couldn't agree more. Colin Kaepernick is the prototypical millennial. He is the prototypical millennial voter. He has already said that he is kneeling before football games because of the racial injustices that he feels as though are happening across the U.S. And I'm not taking anything away from what he's doing there, but what's so interesting is when given the opportunity to be able to enact change that could see some solutions brought about to the situation here in America, he chose to stay absent from the ballot box. So in reality, what Kaepernick has done is the very avenue by which the change that he so desires could happen, he chose to run away from it. So he is absent inside the ballot box, but so loud outside the ballot box. And so what's so interesting is we're seeing Colin Kaepernick very much epitomizing the millennial, as someone that wants to make very much active outside of it on social media. For example, 88% of millennials have a social media account, Facebook account, but only 58% of millennials have even registered to vote. Of the 121 to 126 million people that voted in last Tuesday's election, roughly 21 to 24 million of them were millennials, though millennials are the largest age demographic in today's electorate, which is just fascinating.
But in terms of actually the exit polls, they weren't exactly showing up in significant numbers at the ballot box.
We're not showing up. They fell behind boomers and then Generation X and then millennial, though they are the largest age demographic. But you wouldn't be able to tell from social media and the news because they are the ones that are making probably some of the loudest noises right now, though they didn't make the loudest noise in the place where it counted most, which is inside the ballot box.
So, okay, Colin Kaepernick makes a lot of noise, but he did not vote. There's some evidence that some of the others that have kneeled with him did not vote either. You go to, let's just use the example we were talking about off air a minute ago, in Portland, Oregon, a number that were arrested. I think in round numbers, almost half of them were not even voting as well, right?
Yeah, it's just so fascinating because it's not even that they're not voting, it's they're not even registering, which is just indicative of the apathy that they feel and the lack of trust, right? And so we're seeing, Harvard poll of millennials that came out about a couple of months ago, it said that there's only 33% of them place their trust in the government. That's upwards of 67% fail to trust the very government that's supposed to restrain the evil and keep the laws and secure justice. And it's just so fascinating to see the outworking of the apathy that they feel towards government today.
Well, and again, one of the other questions I want to put on the table, and we may get into some of that tomorrow with you and Chelsea, is the concern that many people have that one of the things that has maybe driven a lot of them away from any kind of political participation is the attacks that have come against those that support Donald Trump. And one of the individuals that we've had on this program before, Dr. George Yancey, he's a professor up at the University of North Texas, and I might just mention African American because this is helpful in his understanding. For years, he looked at discrimination against the black population, but he's also a Christian, and then began to look at discrimination against Christians. And he said on this program and in his books that the discrimination he faced as a Christian was sometimes worse than the discrimination he ever faced as an African American. Wow. So that's the first thing. But then in a piece here, he said if progressives don't want a Trump win in 2020, maybe they should stop attacking religious freedom. Because here's what he said. There were individuals that voted for Donald Trump, and he was not one of them, by the way. George Yancey had really very
very critical things, by the way, to say about Donald Trump. But he said the people that voted for Donald Trump said they feared a loss of religious freedom. They found these fears, and he said, I found these fears quite unfortunate and wanted to move them away from that fear. But I talked about not living in fear. But what I could not do was tell them that their fear was unwarranted. At the end of the day, progressives have to consider if they have overplayed their hand. It is not enough that abortions are legal in the United States. They also fight to force Christian organizations to advise women about abortions. It is not enough that same-sex marriages are legal. Christian bakers must be forced to bake cakes for them, otherwise they pay a penalty. A lay pastor could be fired for daring to preach against those marriages from his pulpit. And of course, that's Dr. Eric Walsh and some of the others. So he said, yes, Christians are right to fear for their religious freedom. And so it's been his argument, and we'll talk about in just a minute, Jonah Goldberg saying, if you want to just keep this going, just keep calling people racist and keep saying that this is all due to white supremacist kind of mindset. And people are going to even be less likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. They've overplayed their hand, haven't they?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, what we're going to continue to see is that that Christians, whether we are a Christian nation or not at the founding, that's subject to speculation. But what we do know to be true is that a large percentage of the constituency of the demographic here in the U.S. is Christian in orientation, and they are a voting group that very much highly values the freedom of religion, one of the founding principles of our country. And so the ability to be able to work out that religion in the various forms and spheres outside of the Sunday morning experience is of extreme importance for them. And so for Democrats, I think they need to continue to try to listen if they want to see any success in the Electoral College in 2020, is to listen to the voices like Michael Ware that is continuing to reach out to them and continuing to give them a voice. That this Christian constituency is very much loud, it's large, and you need to be able to listen to them and to be able to appeal to them if you want to achieve success going forward.
One of the other things that Kelly Shackelford has pointed out, that sometimes when he speaks to groups, he'll even have people coming up and say, look, I'm not even religious, but I recognize that if you lose your religious freedom, I lose my freedom. And so there are a lot of people that are even looking at this saying, okay, I'm a homosexual activist, but I do have real problems with the fact that you are punishing people because they would not bake a cake for you. I don't want that to come around and then force homosexual bakers to have to put out some kind of message that they would disagree with. So they kind of see the implications of where this might go.
Yeah, what one person's loss of freedom could eventually become your loss of freedom, right? And so as our founders saw it fit, they saw the exercise of freedom, the religious freedom would be something that would be for the positive good of our country, that religion produces virtue. Virtue is a good ally to a good government. And so religious people, though you continue to see in the headlines often the outlier situations of the bad, more often than not produce good people, produce good values, and make good neighbors. And so where there's religious freedom, where there's people that are exercising their religion, is a good thing for a good government here in the U.S.
Let's take a break and let's open it up. The last half hour, an open line. Perhaps you have some comments about freedom of religion, some comments about whether it's the NBA or the NFL or some of those issues. We're going to get into a couple of other issues that relate to safe spaces and trigger warnings and all the rest. But if you'd like to join us, let's open up the phones again and give you a chance to join the conversation. Nick Pitt's with us today, and again, Director of Cultural Engagement for the Denison Forum. And if you'd like to know more about him or Jim Denison or the Denison Forum, we have a nice link there. We have a couple of his articles. When we come back, we'll talk more about some of the great resources there at the Denison Forum. But if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
When you hear the phrase spiritual warfare, what comes to mind? If you have a negative reaction, that's unfortunate, because the Bible reveals that the battle is real. As Kirby recently wrote to our partners, Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. It warns us about being taken captive by alien philosophies and deceit. There is a spiritual battle underway for the minds of our neighbors. It's a time when the shapers of our culture are calling evil good and good evil. What can you do? Get a copy, a free copy, of Kirby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy with our compliments at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, Point pointofview.net. Spiritual Warfare, the battle to restore Christ in our culture, by Kirby Anderson. It's free when you visit pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour in studio with us today, Nick Pitts. And if you would like to join our conversation, open line on all sorts of topics. Well, we certainly have set the table with a few that you might want to join us on. 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to South Carolina first. WAGP and Jerry, thank you for calling today.
Thank you for taking my call. I was talking on Facebook with some of my kids' friends who are millennial Bernie supporters and progressive friends who were Hillary supporters, saying, look, Trump's first three people were a woman, Dr. Ben Carson, an African-American, and a homosexual. He is trying to be inclusive, and they came back real strongly with, what about Steve Bannon as his chief of staff, who hates everybody and on and on and on. What do y'all say?
Okay, first of all, I did kind of answer that yesterday, but Steve Bannon's not chief of staff, but he has a very important position. And I went to Gary Bauer because Gary Bauer has known him for years, and we've had Gary Bauer on here. And Gary said just the other day on a piece that every time the right gains the upper hand, the left and its ever-obedient media engage in the politics of personal destruction. He said when the Reagan administration was coming in, the media promoted Bush loyalist James Baker and vilified Ed Meese. Then the left smeared Robert Bork, then turned him into a monster. Then they tried to do the same with Clarence Thomas. He said now Donald Trump is about ready to assume the presidency. The left is looking for a conservative scalp, and it's decided it must destroy Steve Bannon. He says, as you may know, Bannon was the CEO of the influential Breitbart news outlet, and he played a central role in the Trump campaign. But the smear that is being leveled against him is that he's anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and somehow involved in white supremacy. So let me take all those on. First of all, Gary Bauer says, I know Steve Bannon well. He graduated from Harvard Business School. He served in the Navy, including the time in the Pentagon as a special assistant to the Navy's top admiral. He's a patriot and a defender of Israel. He says, my certainty on this is well grounded. He says, I assume you know my strong views about Israel and how I fought anti-Semitism. I have not hesitated to call out people in my own party who I believe are real against Israel. And he goes on to say, in the last 5 years, he co-hosted a show with Tom Rose. It was called The Bauer-Rose Show, known for its robust defense of Judeo-Christian civilization. He said Steve Bannon has been a regular guest on Bauer and Rose. In over 100 interviews, he never expressed one thought that was outside of the conservative mainstream. He has defended Jews. He has defended Israel. He has condemned anti-Semitism. He goes on to say that the Breitbart website routinely defends Israel. It was tremendously supportive of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he came to Congress. And in the last year, Steve proudly opened a Breitbart office in Jerusalem to report on the dangers that Israel routinely faces. And then he goes on and talks about all the people that have defended Steve Bannon. That would be people like Mark Levin, talk show host. But let me use one good example. Bernie Marcus, he's Jewish. He's a Jewish philanthropist. He's the co-founder of Home Depot. Is that good enough for you? And here, this is what Bernie Marcus said about Steve Bannon. He said, quote, these attacks are nothing more than an attempt to undermine the incoming Trump administration. He says, I have known Steve to be a passionate Zionist and a supporter of Israel who felt so strongly about this that he opened a Breitbart office in Israel to ensure that the true pro-Israel story would get out. What is being done to Steve Bannon is a shanda, which is a Jewish word for scandal. So, Jerry, a lot of people that we would respect, whether it's Mark Levin, whether it's Gary Bauer, or whether it's one of the founders of Home Depot who's Jewish, they all think Steve Bannon's pretty good. So maybe some of you people on Facebook need to go back and check their facts.
Yes, I agree with that. There was one more point that was made that I think you pretty much addressed, and that he was getting on the Breitbart report, giving a voice, even if he didn't feel this way, to people like Aryan Nation type of bigotry. That he might not feel that, but he was giving a voice to them.
And again, the argument that they usually made was the article that was in Breitbart that talked about Bill Kristol being a renegade Jew. Well, first of all, the person that wrote that is Jewish himself, David Horowitz. Okay, so first of all, Steve Bannon didn't write it. Second of all, David Horowitz did write it, and David Horowitz, if he's Jewish, could call another person a renegade Jew. I wouldn't use those phrases, but you really have to work and stretch pretty hard to say that was white supremacist or anti-Semitic. So we could go on, but I just wanted to at least try to answer your question about that. Any comments about that, Nick?
Yeah, I think what we're continuing to see is what happens protesting out in the streets is also a form of protesting that's happening in media studios across America, that they're trying to leverage their influence to be able to try to do the best that they can to kind of divert this Trump transition. And what we're continuing to see with Donald Trump is he is the businessman that is bringing together the right people to be able to satisfy the needs of the individuals that were electing him. So what we see with Steve Bannon is very much the person that's outside the mainstream media that very much is going to seek to kind of mend and satisfy some of those needs, and the unrest of the American populace is sick and tired of kind of the establishment. But what we see with Reince Priebus is someone that's going to be able to work Congress, someone that's been in DC for a while, that knows the ways in which to be able to accomplish ends. And so what we see is Donald Trump has been true to his word of wanting to, one, be the voice of America, be the voice of the people with Bannon, but then two, to be able to leverage that voice in such a way to accomplish ends with Priebus.
Yeah, and Reince Priebus actually will be the chief of staff. Mm-hmm. Let's just, before we move on, talk about the Denison Forum for just a minute, because people can sign up to get Jim Denison's daily article, which I always enjoy reading, but now I've
is our principal, and so he sends out this daily article that goes up to upwards of 113,000 people in 203 countries. And what he tries to do is he tries to tackle one particular issue that's facing the day. He doesn't want to raise questions as much as answer the questions that you're already asking. Yeah. And what he tries to do is just believing it to be true, that the Word of God is living and active and speaks to issues of our day. He tries to best understand the issue that you're talking about, best understand the news item that's in the day, and think about it from a biblical perspective and move towards a pragmatic end. I am completely biased, but that is the first thing that I read waking up in the morning. It is just, it's a fresh word every morning, and it's thoughtfully considering the issue of the day, not trying to force the round peg into the square hole. He's just very thoughtful and best epitomizes what Paul says in Ephesians 4:15 of wanting to speak the truth in love in a very gracious and winsome manner. While Jim only takes one article every day, what I try to do with the daily briefing is I take upwards of 9 to 12 articles every day that see what are the things that people are going to be talking about around the water cooler that are going to drive the day, one, but also articles that speak to the spirit of the day. What are the things that people are laughing at, crying at? What are those social science research that's coming about? And what would the biblical narrative speak to those issues? How are we to think about some of the issues that are facing our day, whether it's a viral video of a cross-country meet where an individual kind of gets run over by a deer? Well, it's the reminder from Ephesians 12, right? Mm-hmm. That we all have a race that we're running, but there's difficulties and weights that try to encumber us. And so what I try to do is I try to take a wider scope of the news, a variety of articles, to be able to address them with the biblical narrative.
And the one that you have as your lead story today is where Stephen Hawking said that, we have about 1,000 years left here on this planet. We're otherwise going to have to colonize another planet. Did he calculate the fact that we've now found more oil shale in West Texas than anybody ever anticipated we had out there?
Who would have thought Stephen Hawking would have turned into an apocalyptic preacher, right? Like the last person I thought would do that.
One of yours, and also you got everything from dogs to marijuana to exercise and depression. So you got it all there. So again, if you want to learn a little bit more, we have a link to the Denison Forum. He talked about must read. I've always said Gary Bauer is a must read, Tony Perkins is a must read, and Jim Denison is a must read. And now I'm putting Nick Pitts in that category too. That's a lot to read, but those of us that really want to be in the know, we learn from some of these really bright people out there, and we certainly depend upon their ability to help us think biblically about every area of life. And that's what we're talking about this week on the spiritual warfare.
And you're very kind, because as we're moving into a day that's just very interesting, up is down, down is up, male is female. We're seeing such transitional times, and we live in interesting times. So it's just the ever important need for us to be able to know the world that we live in, one, and then know how to respond to the truth and speak the truth in love. I'm so very much needed.
Chelsea Yeoman and Nick Pitts will be with us tomorrow on our weekend edition, and so if you don't get to all your phone calls today, you are certainly welcome tomorrow. When we come back, we'll talk about a little bit more about how the media is portraying this president. Also, I see one wants to talk about textbooks. We talked about that yesterday with Cynthia Dunbar, so we'll get into that as well, and we certainly will do our best to give as many of you a chance to join the conversation today, and we'll certainly be talking about that tomorrow as we talk about safe spaces, religious freedom, and some of the issues in the news. We'll give you a little bit of an update on the transition. We know some of these people that Donald Trump has tapped to be in his cabinet, and we'll give you a sense of who they are. And, of course, Jerry just asked about Steve Bannon. We have a lot more to talk about them, and we'll do some of that, if not today, tomorrow. Let's take a break. We'll get some of those phone calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Along the trail that winds around the base of the Devil's Tower Monument in Wyoming is a sign placed there by the National Park Service. It's a humble wooden sign that reads simply, "Please do not disturb prayer bundles and prayer cloths." At first glance, the sign seems entirely out of place. Why would the National Park Service be instructing visitors to the nation's first national park about prayer bundles? As it turns out, the reason for the sign is an important lesson in religious liberty. Devil's Tower, known to several Native American tribes as Bear's Lodge, is sacred ground to several tribes. Often, Native Americans return to offer prayers, visible prayers, in the form of small bundles of cloth that visitors can see dangling from the magnificent ponderosa pine trees surrounding the base of Devil's Tower. This is how we integrate religious liberty into everyday life. The National Park Service works to protect the natural wonder that is Devil's Tower while giving preference to the religion of those who hold the mountain to be sacred. Visitors to the park demonstrate respect for the free exercise of the Native American religion by leaving such prayer bundles undisturbed. Sometimes respecting religious liberty takes a lot of effort. Other times, it just means staying on the trail. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Nick Pitts in studio with us today, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to South Carolina, WAGP. Carrie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Nick and Kirby, thank you so much for having me.
Yes.
I just wanted to mention, first of all, I really, really enjoyed your discussion because you're very articulate. Anyway, I think the millennials, one of the things that I find just shocking is that they make an equivalency between words and deeds. In fact, they almost make give words more weight than actual deeds. And so when a politician says, well, I'm going to handle this, I can put up with it, And even if he never follows up, everybody moves on, especially the media, like, oh, well, it's been handled.
Yeah.
And it drives me out of my mind. I would love to see the weight get shifted back to more deed-oriented and result-oriented judgments of policy.
Part of that is due to the current president. There are people that have said that sometimes Barack Obama feels like he's accomplished something by giving a speech. And we sometimes around here maybe do too much of saying, well, that was a good speech, or he gave a good speech. Well, Donald Trump's just kind of the other type. I'm not real good at giving great speeches, but I'm going to get something done, and, you maybe all heard the old get her done, there's a sense in which people are, I think, tired of, words, because talk is really cheap in this 21st century world. You get something done, and people hopefully will remember that. So let's hope that it does turn around pretty quickly.
Absolutely, and I'll be praying for this president, too.
Well, appreciate that. We've been talking about this transition. Everybody's saying, well, it's in disarray. But again, I quoted Gary Bauer just a minute ago. He said, I was part of the Reagan transition, and he's doing about the same as the Reagan transition. Now, true, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, the transition would have been smoother because she probably would have kept, for example, Loretta Lynch in as Attorney General. She probably already had picked out most of her cabinet. I think she'd picked out the draperies for the Oval Office. So, that's that in some respects. Yes, it might have been a little smoother transition, but I don't think this transition's in disarray, other than the fact that there are some people that have turned him down because, as you and I were talking about off air, this Donald Trump transition team requires that if you are going to serve in the cabinet, you sign a document that says that 5 years after the time that you've served in this government, you will not be a lobbyist. And so that's kind of a deal breaker for a few of these people.
Yeah, that's a big financial cut. So, I mean, you're recruiting some of the best in the industry, and the private sector pays far greater than the government would pay, for better or for worse. And so you're having these individuals that are making 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 times as much in the private sector, and then you're asking them to take a significant pay cut to serve their country. And for better or for worse, they're choosing otherwise. And so it's just an interesting little feature of working for our government.
We're paying maybe too much attention to people getting in the elevators right now. Is the pizza guy going to be a part of the cabinet?
I do not recommend and I do not endorse what I was doing, but I was checking Twitter on the way over here, and one of the things that I ran into is I saw this little meme that, there's so much attention that's being given to the Trump Tower right now where all the transition talks are happening. And so I saw a meme where there was an individual that had taken a picture of the pizza guy that was delivering himself up and then put the question, potential cabinet member. And so I don't know, but I guess to go back to go back to your comments, Kerry, he's getting something done. He's delivering the pizza.
He's delivering the pizza,
which in my book is probably one of the highest points you can do.
Yes. But again, your point is well taken. Public service should be service. Mm-hmm. And we've seen entirely too many individuals. I remember when I was at graduate school in Georgetown, we talked about the revolving door, the individuals, sort of the iron triangle. They'd serve in Congress, they'd serve in the bureaucracy, they serve as lobbyists, and it was a self-perpetuating mindset. And if you really are dedicated, as it seems to me that Donald Trump and Mike Pence are, of draining the swamp, that means you're going to have to keep a few alligators from actually going into that particular office, and you're going to really probably ruffle a lot of feathers along the way, too.
And I think one of the things that we can take heart in is some of the news that was made, I think 2 or 3 days ago, where Donald Trump said that I'm only going to take a salary of $1 during time. Now, granted, that's not much.
I think he'll earn every penny.
Yeah.
I think he'll earn every penny.
Well, granted, he's bringing in a fortune, but I mean, leading by example of showing that there's great sacrifice to come with your country. But as we know as Christians, those sacrifices more often than not prove to be more worthy at the long end of the spectrum. And so I think by leading by example, there's just that type of leader can allure top talent to be able to come into the administration. And it should be a very interesting 4 years. And so it's going to be exciting to be a part of kind of what's going to happen.
Yeah, Mike Pence was on Capitol Hill the other day, and again, trying to mend some fences, build some bridges, but also taking some names and numbers and things, too. That's kind of interesting.
It was so fun to be able to see some of the selfies that he took relative with congressional Republicans during that time, and it seems like it's just very encouraging, I guess you could say, to be able to see a White House that's working with Congress, to be able to carry, like what you said, to get things done. And one of the interesting tidbits that I always like to keep in the back of my mind is that the average American has an attention span lifespan of 8.2 seconds. A goldfish is 9 seconds. And so we did, as individuals that are a part of a government for the people and by the people, it's going to be increasingly incumbent upon us not only to elect these officials, but to hold them accountable as well. That yes and amen, they're working together, and that's going to be a beautiful thing. But for us to be able to follow up and to really press into some of those issues that we so desire to be able to see accomplished.
Yes, well, or attention span of 140 characters, either one. Let's see if we can get to Jacob in Georgia here, and if you did not get through today, we'll certainly give you an opportunity tomorrow. Jacob, I'll make you the last call of the day.
Okay, Kirby, how you doing? And thank God for you, the ministry. And I say to everybody who listening, please support this ministry. Without this ministry, we would not have a voice. So, but what I'm here to talk about, Kirby, is I thank God that Donald Trump is not being deterred by the media. To me, the media is anti-Bible, anti-God, anti-Jesus, the majority of them. And they are anti-morals. And when you look at the blacks, the majority of blacks in the United States who are in love with the Democratic Party, they are against morals. They are against, they talk about racism, about people being racist. But you will find today that there are more black racists than there is white racists. And you'll find today that you have a group of liberals, whoever they might be, that look at black folks as being less knowledgeable. You say white supremacists. They are the ones that are actually white supremacists because they are looking down at black people as though they are not equal to them. And so what they do is get blacks to follow their leads, and then you get the ignorant blacks, the pastors, the black pastors, the majority of them black pastors, bishops, priests, all of them. They buy into the lie that white folks are racist.
Jacob, I'm going to have to go in just a minute, so I'm going to give you a final comment here because we're just about out of time.
All right. Well, as I say, Kirby, maybe by the help of the Lord one day, you and I will be able to I'll be able to get on your show and we can really get deep into this thing because there is a gulf almost between black and white relationship.
Well, that's for sure. Well, Jacob, appreciate your phone call. And Nick, I thank you so very much for being in studio, but I'm going to get to see you tomorrow for 2 hours. Right?
I don't know what you had to what you did to have to endure such punishment. Me 2 days in a row, but I'll be praying for you for sure.
Yeah, well, again, the Denison Forum. Sign up for Jim Denison's daily article, but also the Nick Pitts daily briefing, and it's all there at the Denison Forum. We have a link to it, denisonforum.org, and I look forward to having you here tomorrow. So thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
We are going to spend some time tomorrow talking about the sword, the Word of God, but also we've been talking this week about the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, and the helmet of salvation. And again, don't forget you can get a copy of our spiritual warfare book. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
When you hear the phrase spiritual warfare, what comes to mind? If you have a negative reaction, that's unfortunate because the Bible reveals that the battle is real. As Kirby recently wrote to our partners, Romans 12:2 tells us not to be conformed to the culture, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. It warns us about being taken captive by alien philosophies and deceit. There is a spiritual battle underway for the minds of our neighbors. It's a time when the shapers of our culture are calling evil good and good evil. What can you do? Get a copy, a free copy of Kirby Anderson's new ebook, Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture. It is a spiritual battle, and it must be fought with spiritual weapons. Get your copy with our compliments at pointofview.net. Look for Spiritual Warfare, pointofview.net. Spiritual Warfare, The Battle to Restore Christ in Our Culture by Kirby Anderson. It's free when you visit pointofview.net.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.